They thought she was just another face in the crowd. No robe, no title showing, just a quiet, black woman standing in the back of a Charleston courtroom. So when two police officers slapped her across the face, right there, in front of witnesses, they thought they could get away with it. But here's the question. What happens when the woman you try to silence turns out to be the most powerful person in the room? Because in the next 4 minutes, everything they built, their careers, their protection, their silence, began to unravel. This isn't just a story about a slap. It's about what follows when someone finally says, enough. Let me show you how justice moved, not with noise, but with precision. It started in a courtroom that had seen too much and changed too little. Morning light slanted through tall windows, casting soft shadows on worn wooden benches. The day's docket was long, the gallery half full, and the tension, as always, just beneath the surface. Officer Craig Whitmore and his partner, Officer Dean Halpern, entered with the same swagger they carried into every room, shoulders high, gaze low, convinced they owned the space. They weren't there for a major bust, just a routine escort, a transfer hearing for a young man who'd been in holding over the weekend. In the corner, a middle-aged black woman stood silently, wearing simple slacks and a blouse. No robe, no badge, nothing to hint at her title. Whitmore barely looked at her before gesturing for her to move. She didn't. He stepped closer, voice rising. Still, she didn't respond. And then, with all the entitlement of a man who'd never been told no, Whitmore slapped her. Open palm. No hesitation. Halpern stood by saying nothing. A few gasps rippled through the room, but no one moved. To Whitmore, it was just another day, just another person who didn't comply. But to those who were watching, really watching, there was something different about her reaction. She didn't raise her voice, didn't retreat. She looked at him, not with fear, not even with anger, just with clarity, as if she had seen this before, survived it before, and no longer needed to prove anything. Across the courtroom, 68-year-old Harold Jenkins, a retired bus driver, shifted in his seat. He'd lived in Charleston his whole life. He'd seen men in uniform treat women like they didn't belong, like their presence was a problem to be removed. He'd taught his daughters what to say, how to say it, how not to move too quickly or speak too loudly. Watching this woman take a hit and remain rooted stirred something deeper than rage in him. It stirred recognition. And then came the moment that changed everything. She took one step forward, fixed her gaze on Officer Whitmore, and said clearly, calmly, "My name is Judge Evelyn Hart. You just assaulted the presiding judge of this court." The silence that followed wasn't immediate. It rolled through the room in waves. First disbelief, then confusion, then the slow, sharp realization that something irreversible had just happened. Whitmore didn't move. Halpern blinked, as if trying to undo what had just been done. A young clerk dropped a pen. And Harold? He sat up straighter, breath caught halfway in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he saw a shift begin right where it needed to, in the very room where too much had been ignored for far too long. But this story wasn't about one slap, or even one judge. It was about what happens when the person you dismiss turns out to be the one holding all the power, and chooses to use it, not for revenge, but for accountability. Because this time, the woman they tried to silence didn't just speak, she decided to listen to every buried truth in that room and answer it out loud. They thought she was just a face in the crowd. But when Judge Evelyn Hart spoke her name, it didn't just shift the mood, it fractured the illusion that control was on their side. Officer Whitmore froze. His partner Halpern instinctively stepped back, as if trying to distance himself from the slap that had just echoed too loudly. Around them, murmurs broke out. A court officer looked toward the bench, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't point. She simply stepped forward, standing squarely in the light that now felt heavier than the walls around her. "You put your hands on the wrong person," she said. But the truth beneath that sentence wasn't about ego. It was about history. About how many times she had walked into rooms where her title meant nothing until she had to say it out loud. In the front row, 72-year-old Marlene Curtis, former public school teacher, felt a slow tear well in her eye. She'd been silenced in teachers' lounges, second-guessed in parent meetings, and made to feel invisible in spaces where she'd given everything. Watching Evelyn stand unshaken wasn't just empowering, it was personal. She didn't flinch, Marlene whispered to herself. She made them see her. Evelyn knew exactly what would happen next. Procedures would kick in. Protocols. The kind they only followed when the wrong person was watching. She turned to the bailiff. "Seal the courtroom. I'm initiating a judicial misconduct review, effective immediately." She said it not with urgency, but with certainty. Because justice wasn't something she was requesting. It was something she was now enforcing. Whitmore's mouth opened slightly, as if searching for an excuse, a justification, something to cling to, but nothing came out. Not because he was stunned, but because deep down, he knew. He had mistaken presence for passivity, silence for irrelevance, and now the courtroom he once moved through with unchecked confidence no longer belonged to him. Evelyn walked back to the bench, not with drama, not for applause, but because that was her seat. And as she sat, the room finally understood. This wasn't about revenge. It was about a line being drawn clearly for everyone to see. Outside, the courthouse lawn remained quiet. Inside, the echo of one name, spoken at the right moment, had changed everything. Once the doors closed, the courtroom changed. Not in noise, but in weight. There was no longer a sense of routine, no comfort in the script of justice as usual. What Judge Evelyn Hart had set in motion could not be contained within the four walls of a hearing room. Cameras were already rolling, internal, silent, unblinking. Every word, every shift, every hesitation was being preserved. For once, accountability wasn't whispered in back offices. It was being written in real time. Evelyn called for the immediate retrieval of surveillance footage. She requested a transcription of the incident to be entered into the official record. Then, without pause, she asked the clerk to retrieve Officer Whitmore's disciplinary file. No one in the room expected her to act that fast or that methodically. In the third row, Leonard Briggs, 75, a former postal worker, sat with his arms crossed tightly. He'd seen so many promises of justice buried in paperwork. So many cases where footage went missing, complaints couldn't be verified, and the ones who filed them were quietly labeled troublemakers. But today, he saw a judge who didn't flinch at the weight of procedure. She knew the system, and she was using it, not to protect the institution, but to protect its purpose. As the reports began to arrive, Evelyn read them with calm precision. 6 complaints of excessive force, 3 unresolved misconduct allegations, 1 off-the-record settlement that was never logged in the central system. None of them were new, but until now, none of them had mattered. Because until now, no one with authority had insisted they'd be read aloud. Halpern, now visibly shaken, kept his gaze low. Whitmore remained stiff, his eyes flickering to the door as if hoping for someone to walk in and take this burden off his back. But no one came. This time, the shield he had worn so confidently no longer fit. Evelyn looked around the room, her voice steady, deliberate. "We are not here to humiliate. We are here to document." Because when justice is ignored long enough, memory becomes a weapon, and truth becomes our only shield. In that moment, the courtroom no longer felt like a place where things were decided behind closed chambers. It felt like a place where someone had finally opened the window and let the truth walk in. And as she set the files down, a new stack arrived, witness statements. The silence deepened, not from fear but from clarity. People were no longer asking what just happened. They were preparing to say what they had seen. The documents kept coming. What started as a single incident now stretched into years of unchecked behavior. Judge Evelyn Hart read each line with the same steady breath. Not because she was numb, but because she refused to let outrage distract her from the work. There were names on those papers, dozens of them. People who had filed complaints and never heard back. People who had been labeled aggressive for defending themselves. People whose stories had been filed away like clutter in a system that only seemed to move when it was forced to see. Evelyn called for the inclusion of all formal and informal grievances tied to Officer Whitmore, dating back 10 years. The list grew quickly. Complaints that were dismissed as unsubstantiated. Reports flagged but never followed up. Internal notes marked resolved with no explanation. No one had connected the dots. Until now. And the pattern that emerged was no longer deniable. In the second row, Florence DeWitt, 70, sat gripping her cane, Her grandson had been arrested 2 years ago in a case that made no headlines but left bruises no one wanted to explain. She'd filed a complaint, waited, called, waited again. Nothing. Now, hearing that same officer's name repeated over and over, she whispered, so it wasn't just him. For people like Florence, this wasn't news, it was confirmation. A quiet validation that what had happened to their families wasn't imagined, it had been ignored. Across the room, Assistant District Attorney Michael Ramsey watched with narrowing eyes. His name hadn't been spoken, but he knew the tide was rising. Evelyn requested that any documentation related to cases prosecuted under Ramsey's oversight involving Officer Whitmore be re-examined. Ramsey didn't object, but his silence said enough. This is no longer about one incident, Evelyn said, her voice even but firm. This is about a structure that has protected abuse through neglect and occasionally through choice. She wasn't reading from a script. She didn't need to. The facts were writing their own indictment. As the hearing adjourned for the day, Evelyn remained at the bench, her hand resting not on a gavel, but on the pile of papers in front of her. Not one of them had come from nowhere. They had all been there, waiting. All she did was stop pretending they weren't. And as she rose to leave, she paused at the edge of the bench. Her eyes didn't sweep the room. They landed on one spot, the complaint form box in the back corner, barely visible, dusty with disuse. That would be the next place she'd start. By the third day of hearings, something shifted, not just in the courtroom, but in the hallways outside. A quiet resistance had begun to stir. Not from the public, but from those who had the most to lose. Files started going missing. A witness, once willing to speak, suddenly declined. A low-level clerk was reassigned without warning. And Judge Evelyn Hart, though calm as ever on the bench, began locking her office door during lunch. Late one evening, as she returned home, an envelope was waiting on her porch. No note, just a photograph. Her 14-year-old nephew Jacob leaving football practice. The message wasn't written, but it was clear. Back down, or we'll come closer. Evelyn didn't call a press conference. She didn't post a statement. She picked up her phone and contacted the U.S. Marshals. I'm not asking for protection, she told them. I'm asking for a perimeter. I have work to finish. The next morning, federal agents took up quiet positions around the courthouse. Not to intimidate, but to make sure this wasn't buried before it was finished. Because what Evelyn had tapped into wasn't just misconduct. It was a structure, long-standing and well-defended, that did not take kindly to being unmasked. In the gallery, 67-year-old Walter Ellis, a retired steelworker and Vietnam veteran, took note. He'd seen this before, not in a courtroom, but in chain-of-command politics where those who protected the truth were often left exposed. They don't threaten you unless they're scared, he muttered. That means she's closer than they want her to be. Despite the pressure, Evelyn pressed forward. She requested a federal review of every complaint buried under internal resolution that involved the officers named in her growing report. She asked for oversight not from within, but from outside the jurisdiction. It was a move that made her a target, but it also made her message clear. This wasn't personal, it was structural. The fear that had once lived in the community now moved up the chain. For the first time in years, it wasn't the residents watching their backs. It was the ones in charge. As the next hearing began, Evelyn entered the courtroom with a binder under one arm and Jacob's photo in the other. She didn't need to show it. Just holding it said enough. The message had come through. But she had one of her own. I don't scare easy, she said quietly before the first file was read. And I don't stop when I know I'm right. They didn't come in with sirens. No spectacle. No warning. Just 3 federal agents in plain suits stepping into the courtroom as the morning session opened. Officer Craig Whitmore didn't rise from his seat. He didn't speak. He knew what this was. One agent approached him quietly, read the warrant, and placed him in cuffs. No resistance. No last word. The courtroom held its breath. Not because they were shocked he was arrested, but because they weren't used to seeing it happen. Judge Evelyn Hart didn't look up as the agents approached. She continued reviewing the case file in front of her, allowing the moment to unfold without dramatics. This wasn't a climax. This was a step. Outside, the news broke within minutes. Officer Whitmore, taken into federal custody. Headlines speculated about charges, past cases, and what it meant for the city. But inside the courthouse, Evelyn's focus remained unchanged. She wasn't chasing a fall from grace. She was tracking a pattern, and Whitmore was only one thread in the weave. Across the aisle, 69-year-old Carolyn Mason, who had lost faith in courtroom outcomes after her son's case was dismissed years ago, leaned forward with cautious hope. "That's one man," she said under her breath. "Let's see if they're ready to look at the system that made him feel untouchable." Because this moment, Whitmore's arrest, wasn't about one officer's accountability. It was about institutional memory being forced to acknowledge what it once buried. Evelyn knew how many people would now try to paint this as an isolated act, a single bad cop removed. Problem solved. But she wouldn't allow that narrative to stick. Immediately after the arrest, she motioned for a procedural reset. "We are not finished," she told the room. "We are only removing what blocked the view. Now we look deeper." She ordered a fresh audit of all arrest records involving Whitmore, not just for misconduct but for prosecutorial bias, inconsistencies in evidence, and sentencing disparities. She wanted to see not just what he did, but what others allowed to happen because of him. As Whitmore was led away through the side door, his badge no longer on his chest, Evelyn took one long breath and returned to the paperwork. There were still dozens of files to review, cases to reopen, names to remember. No applause, no nods of approval, just the quiet sound of justice beginning to move, not fast, not loud, but forward. By the end of the week, the courtroom was no longer just a space for legal arguments. It had become a threshold. People entered not to witness routine decisions, but to see if something long overdue might actually shift. Judge Evelyn Hart had reviewed over 200 pages of misconduct reports, case files, and suppressed complaints. Patterns no longer needed to be proven. They revealed themselves. And with that, she was ready to name names. The morning hearing opened differently. No trial, no cross-examination. Just one list, 12 names, judges, prosecutors, senior officers, people whose signatures sat on files that never should have been closed. Evelyn read each one with clarity, not accusation but exposure. She wasn't condemning them in public. She was returning their decisions to public light, where they belonged all along. No gasps filled the room, no chaos. Just a weight. Like the truth had been set down on the table and no one dared push it away. ADA Michael Ramsey, who had remained silent through previous sessions, shifted in his chair as his name was read fifth. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was its own verdict. In the gallery, Robert Green, 66, who'd worked 30 years in the city clerk's office, pressed a hand over his heart. "She's not doing this for applause," he whispered to the woman beside him. "She's doing this because no one else ever did." Evelyn ended the reading with a simple directive. She submitted a formal request to the U.S. Department of Justice, calling for a full federal review of all cases tied to the individuals named. She cited not political pressure, but systemic erosion, justice denied not by chaos, but by careful, quiet decisions stacked over decades. When the press requested comment, she declined to offer sound bites. "This is not a story," she said. "This is evidence." And then she turned back to her desk, not to rest, but to continue. Because for every name on that list, there were a dozen more hidden behind closed doors. And she wasn't here to burn the building down. She was here to open every locked room and let the light in. As court adjourned for the day, Evelyn stood alone at the bench. Not lonely, just unaccompanied. It's how most people look when they walk first. 2 weeks after the first hearing, Judge Evelyn Hart stood before a podium. Not in her courtroom, but in a modest press room just down the hall. There were no flags behind her, no dramatic lighting, and no rehearsed applause. Just a single microphone and a stack of prepared statements she didn't intend to read. "I came into this role to interpret the law," she began, "but I stayed in it to protect the people the law was written for." She paused, eyes steady. Then she announced her resignation. It wasn't an act of defeat. It wasn't exhaustion. It was a choice. Evelyn believed that real change could not grow in soil still clinging to old roots. She had done what she came to do: expose the system, trigger oversight, and force open the locked drawers. Now it was time for someone new to walk through the door she had pried open. In the small crowd, Deborah Wells, 71, a retired union organizer, nodded slowly. She had led more strikes than she could count, and knew that stepping aside wasn't weakness, it was clarity. Sometimes, she whispered to herself, the most powerful thing a leader can do is make room. Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply stated the facts, that over 140 past convictions were now under federal review, that a civil rights audit of the police department was underway, that for the first time in 2 decades, the State Judiciary Committee was holding open hearings on racial bias and prosecutorial conduct. She had done her part. When asked what she would do next, Evelyn didn't offer big plans. "I'll rest," she said. "Then I'll teach. And if I'm needed again, I'll come." Before leaving the room, she handed over a sealed folder to a young public defender standing in the back. No one knew what was inside, but it was clear from her expression, the work wasn't finished. It was simply changing hands. As she walked out of the building, not escorted, not flanked by press, there was no applause, no grand send-off, just the quiet sound of her footsteps down the corridor, the same hallway she had walked every morning for 15 years. Because when you choose to step down with your head high, what you leave behind isn't absence, it's space. For someone else to rise, and for something better to begin. The courtroom didn't fall silent after Judge Evelyn Hart stepped down. It settled, it steadied, and in that stillness, something began to take root. Over the next few months, 147 convictions tied to Officer Whitmore and his collaborators were placed under review. At least 28 were overturned. Dozens more were re-examined with fresh eyes. The police department came under federal oversight. A civil rights audit revealed what many already knew, but could finally prove. Yet what changed most was not on paper. It was in the way people carried themselves into the courthouse. They no longer whispered when something felt wrong. They asked, they challenged, they remembered her example, and acted before it was too late. Evelyn's name wasn't carved into any marble. There was no statue in her honor. But in one of the side hallways, a small note was tacked to the bulletin board. Handwritten, no signature. It said, "Speak clearly, someone might be listening." 16-year-old Jacob Hart passed it one morning on his way to school. He paused, read it twice, and smiled. As for Evelyn, she stayed out of the spotlight. No memoir, no press tour, just quiet evenings at home, advising young lawyers who came to her porch with questions that had no simple answers. She didn't tell them what to do. She reminded them what not to ignore. Because the kind of justice she believed in was never about grand gestures. It was about persistence, about people who kept showing up, who told the truth, not loudly but firmly, until someone had to listen. And maybe, if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of noise, this story was for you. If you've ever felt powerless in the face of authority, press 1 in the comments. If you believe quiet integrity can still change a broken system, press 2. And if stories like this matter to you, don't just scroll past, subscribe. This channel tells the truths that don't make headlines, but deserve to be heard.